Now during the Sewing Machine 101 video, I explained that by taking 2 pieces of fabric, giving yourself an allowance of that fabric to create a seam allowance, and stitching those 2 pieces together, by opening the 2 pieces of fabric up and pressing flat, you end up with a seam. This is the start to all garment construction. It looks nice and clean and pretty from the outside when you don't have a bunch of thread stuck to it. Nice and clean finish from the outside. And this is how we join multiple pieces of fabric together into a garment or any other kind of sewing project. But on the inside, you might notice the fabric tends to fray in some cases. It may not look very good, and depending on the fabric that you have, if it frays enough, it could fray all the way to the stitching line, causing a hole in your garment. So the first thing we're going to look at for our sample book will be seam finishes. Seam finishes not only make our seams, our raw seam allowances look prettier, look a little more appealing to the eye, it also makes them more durable and longer lasting. The first seam finish sample I'm going to do is the turned and stitched seam finish. I'm going to use the 3/4 inch seam allowance pattern. I'd have to cut 6 of these for the entire sample book. I'm only going to use 2 for this sample. So the 3/4 inch seam allowance pattern, I'm going to take 2 pieces of muslin for that. I've marked my seam lines with chalk so I can see where my stitching lines are. I've also transferred my notches by clipping into my fabric. So I have notches on either end to help me align my 2 pieces of fabric together. With your 2 pieces of muslin, place them together along the same edges. Again, your notches should align on both top and bottom. And ensure that your marked lines, whether you mark them with a friction pen or with your transfer paper, be sure that those are facing out towards you, or if I flip this over again, should be facing up and away from you. This way, we've identified the wrong side of our fabric. We don't really want to see these marks on the right side of the fabric when we're finished. And I'm going to pin these together using some quilter's pins. I highly recommend these quilter's pins. They're much sharper and more durable than some other types of pins that you might find. And I'm going to pin through both layers. Make sure your pin goes through both layers of fabric. Again, 2 pieces of muslin, 3/4 inch seam allowance pattern with the stitching line marked and notches at the top and bottom of the patterns. Place your marked seam stitching lines facing out, so I can see the stitching line facing up towards me and again facing up towards me, and pin them in place. Now how you pin these together is up to the individual. You'll see how I pin mine with the head of the pins going out towards the right hand side. I am right hand dominant. This way I can easily remove my pins while I'm sewing. You do not want to sew over your pins. Do not sew over your pins. So these are pinned together. Pins are going all the way through the fabric. I will also apply my pins going perpendicular to my stitching line. I recommend you do the same. Let's take this over to the sewing machine. All right, over here at my sewing machine, I'm going to raise my presser foot and slide my fabric in between the presser foot and the feed dog plate. Lower my presser foot, and I'm going to walk my first 2 stitches using my hand wheel. 1 and 2. Place my hand on the reverse stitch lever, hold that down, and walk 2 more stitches back. And again, I will not be sewing over my pins, so I can remove those. I'm going to go ahead and sew all along my marked stitch line. As I get to the end, I'm going to slow down. I'm going to walk my stitches. Now I do have a notch on the end, so I can only sew so far before I reach that notch where there's not really going to be any fabric for me to sew into. Holding down my reverse lever, taking about 2 or 3 stitches back, still walking those stitches, removing my hand from the reverse lever, and then stitching 2 or 3 stitches forward. I'm going to make sure that my take-up lever is all the way up, raise my presser foot, and remove my work from the machine. I'm going to clip my threads on both the end and the beginning of my seam. And that should be a 3/4 inch seam. You can measure from your stitching line to the raw edge of the fabric. Should be 3/4 of an inch. And now I'm going to go to my iron. Alright, here I am at the iron. I've got my sewn sample. I'm going to take the 2 pieces of fabric apart. Open those up. This would be the right side of my garment, nice and clean finished. And then the wrong side that still has my seam allowance. I'm going to spread these 2 edges apart. You want to pull a little bit taut on either side to make sure that you don't get any fabric that curls under itself. So pull the 2 apart, press this flat, and then set it with your iron with a bit of steam. So you should have a nice flat finish on the wrong side where your seam allowance is, and the right side where your seam allowance isn't. I'm going to take this back over to my work table to show you the next step. So back at the work table, here's my seam allowance on the wrong side of my garment. I'm going to grab my ruler and my friction pen, and I'm going to measure a 1/4 inch in from the raw edge of my seam allowance and give myself a guideline with my friction pen. I'll do the same on the other side, measuring in by a 1/4 inch. That's 2 small squares on these little clear rulers. Now from here, I'm going to lift up my work. I'm going to pinch this seam allowance on my right hand side and let everything else fall to the left hand side of my work. So now I only have my seam allowance in my hand, and I'm going to fold along this line that I've just made. I'm just going to fold my fabric back along this line, and I'm going to pinch the fabric together. This is called finger pressing, where the heat of your fingers should be enough to put a crease in your fabric. So there, I've just folded it, and I've just finger pressed it in place, just pinching it with my fingers. I'm going to give it a little bit more of a finger press here. And that should be enough to move on to the next step. I'm going to go ahead and do the same to the other side of my seam allowance. Again, pinching just the seam allowance, not the actual garment fabric. Pinching the seam allowance, lifting it up, and taking everything else over to the right hand side of my sample. So all I have here is that loose seam allowance, folding along this line and folding under, and finger pressing, pinching and finger pressing into place. Okay, that's enough to get us started. And you can take a look here, again from the wrong side of our sample. You can kind of get an idea of what's about to happen. Once we tuck those raw edges underneath, we're now going, which is the turn in the turned and stitched, we are now going to stitch it into place, which is the stitched portion of the turned and stitched. So I'm going to head back to my sewing machine. Back here at my sewing machine, now I've got my seam allowance folded under on either side. Just as I did at my workstation, I'm going to pinch just my seam allowance here with my right hand and tuck everything else underneath. So now I just have my seam allowance folded under. All my other fabric and the other side of my seam allowance is all sitting on the left-hand side. I'm going to make sure this is nice and folded along that edge. I'm going to raise my presser foot. Remember to keep this folded under. There's the other bit of the fold under there. Keep that folded. And just stitch through this folded seam allowance. Do not sew through the rest of the muslin. We don't want to see the top stitching on this. Raise your presser foot and slide your fabric into the machine. Now this is going to get us accustomed to top stitching on the machine. Top stitching is stitching that the user, the wearer, might see. I'm going to move my camera over just a little bit so you can see how I've positioned this in the machine. I've placed the folded edge of my turned seam allowance along the inner edge of this rightmost toe on my foot. So again, this folded edge right here from my seam allowance is aligned towards the inner edge of this rightmost toe on my presser foot. By placing it at this point, when I sew my stitching where my needle is, right about here, it will sew about a 1/16 of an inch away from that folded edge, giving a nice, tight, clean top stitch along that folded edge. So again, I'm using my presser foot as a seam guide, as a stitching guide for me. Again, I'm going to take 2 stitches forward, press down on my reverse lever, and take 2 stitches back, and then stitch all the way along through this folded fabric, keeping the edge of my fabric aligned to that innermost toe. Guiding the fabric through, making sure it stays folded. As I get near the end, I'm going to slow down and again walk my stitches, get close to the end there, push down on my reverse lever, 2 stitches back, and then remove my hand from the reverse lever and 2 stitches forward. And there's my back tack. Make sure my uptake lever is all the way up. Raise my presser foot, remove my work, snip my threads at the beginning and at the end. And now I've got a nice 1/16 of an inch top stitch. It's going through my folded seam allowance. The rest of the fold is sitting underneath there. And I haven't caught any of my other fabric. It's only sewn through this folded seam allowance. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side here. I'm just going to turn my work around so I can still sew with the same orientation, pinching my seam allowance, my folded seam allowance, and then pulling all the rest of my sample to my left. So again, I only have the seam allowance and its fold, and I'm only sewing through that. All the rest of my sample is over here to my left. Raising my foot, sliding my folded fabric underneath, aligning that fold to the innermost edge of my presser foot toe, right along there, lowering my needle, 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back, and continue sewing. I'm going to make sure my fabric is folded as I guide it into the machine. Just making sure my fabric is folded as I go. And again, as I get near the end, slowing down, walking my stitches, getting close to that edge, but not all the way off the edge. We want to keep our stitching in the fabric. Reverse 2 stitches, come forward 2 stitches, make sure my take-up lever is all the way up, lift my presser foot, remove my work, and clip my threads. There are my 2 top stitched edges. My seam allowances are still loose. I haven't sewn through the rest of my muslin here. I'm going to go back to the iron, give this another press, and get rid of these friction pen marks. Alright, back at the ironing board, here is my sample. If my camera will focus. I've got my seam allowance here on the wrong side, turned under and stitched in place on both sides. Turned under and stitched in place. Just going to hit this with the iron one more time, make sure it's nice and flat, and get rid of those pen marks. And now we can eliminate the worry of having these raw edges that might come undone. We've got some stitching to help reinforce it, and it looks much cleaner from the inside. All those nasty raw edges are hiding underneath the seam. There it is, folded underneath there, and folded underneath here. So this would be the wrong side of your garment, the inside of your garment, and this would be the right side of your garment. And that concludes the turned and stitched seam finish.